I'm talking today to Professor Anthony Caleshu from the University of Plymouth. And Anthony is the Professor of Poetry, and I suppose I really should disclose he was also my dissertation supervisor. And publicly, I'd say thank you very much for your supervision.
It's a delight, always.
Thank you. So we're going to talk today about Anthony's latest book, which is a collection of poetry called Xenia, etc. And I'd just like to hand over to you to start with. Tell us about your motivation for the overarching subject. What's it all about?
Yeah. So I've always been interested in the visual arts. As a writer, I think it's probably one becomes interested in things that they don't do as much as the very thing that they do. So for somebody who works with words, I was very interested in understanding those people who work with the visual arts, work with paint primarily. And so I've been fascinated by contemporary visual artists for so many years. I thought I would try and write a book which was, part dedication, part homage, part reflection, and also part something new, something that could springboard from the visual arts into this new otherworldly written space. So that was it.
Okay, and the artists that you've chosen to write about, when I sort of scanned through the list, and I thought, none of these names are leaping off the page, so I had to go to the internet. Are these people that you've met personally? Obviously, people can tell from your accent that you hail from the other side of the pond originally. A lot of these artists are American-based. Do you actually have an interaction with these people on a one-to-one basis, or just things you've seen in galleries?
Yeah, no, I have no interaction with them. These artists, they're contemporary artists that are very well known in certain circles, but I don't have a personal relationship with them. I'm just a big fan, actually.
Right.
So, it was always just a case of seeing the work, loving the work, wanting to use the work as a way for me to reflect on different things. So, the art always was a way to get to the next space for me, and that was usually a new imaginative world. So I was really interested in using the art, but only going so far with it. These aren't poems that are absolutely 100% wed to documenting what the artists were doing. That would seem to be quite a boring mode of ekphrasis. This mode was more, let's see where we can springboard from. Where can we jump off of from looking at this art that that I happen to love?
And so the interaction that you've got with it, we talk about, for example, in Shearsman's work with pottery. Did the event with the urn occur?
Say it again?
The event with the urn, did that occur?
Did that occur? So the urn gets broken in the poem. And in fact, no, not to me, but I'll tell you. So that poem was also kind of subtitled with a small nod to the Brady Bunch, where it does occur, which is it's a TV kind of sitcom from my youth.
I do, yeah. Well, we're of a similar age. I do recall it. Yeah, it made it across here. And Jonas Wood. I found a comment. It said, of all the possible things he could paint, the thing that interests him most is something that he can get close enough to in order to paint it honestly. How close are you to his work? What's the depth of your familiarity with Jonas?
Oh, again, I don't know him personally, but I know the work really well. I've been looking quite closely. We talk about close reading, but I've been doing some close looking at Jonas Wood's work for more than a decade now. This is actually an artist that comes from the Boston area, which is where I grew up, and he's a little bit younger than me, but similar age. I think probably similar interests. He painted sports figures for a lot of years, and still may do a dip into it. He painted baseball cards and basketball cards, which I was a fond collector of when I was in my young kind of kid years. But he's also, the stuff that he's also close to, that he's interested in, is painting pots and vases, which his partner, his wife, is Shio Kusaka. Actually, you mentioned her. So they, he paints her pots and she makes pots sometimes, at least, referring to his paintings. I think it's just such an interesting collaborative relationship that I was fascinated by that. And I wanted to start the book. Well, I'm kind of looking at them as a makerly couple, which is the first poem, which is called Proem.
Yeah, so, I mean, there was an item I was reading about on is it the Gagosian gallery? Gagosian. And it says something along the lines that Wood combines historical references with the images that surround him, and they translate these into flat colour from the 3-dimension. Do you see the Francis you're using doing a reconversion, taking it back from a 2-dimensional figure into something more 3-dimensional?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I definitely, I think, what's being talked about there is Eliot's tradition and the individual talent. So you have this sense of tradition. You have what Wood does is he brings his own individual talent to this incredible knowledge of tradition. And then what I'm doing is I suppose I'm looking at that work and am I bringing it back into 3D? I think what I'm doing is using it as a way to get to the next imaginative sphere. For me, everything is about making it new, making kind of new imaginative possibilities. And so they become 3-dimensional? I mean, they're still on a page. They are scenic, I suppose, but they're still 2D in that they're poems. They're poems on a page.
I don't think they do, actually, because I can imagine myself into the situation. So I guess it's 3-dimensional in that respect.
Well, that's the hope. So yeah, I'll take that as a compliment, because I mean the goal is to present you with scenes, which if you look at a bunch of these poems hopefully should give you a sense of something almost filmic, which again is a 2D thing, but it's based on trying to give you that immersive sense of a 3-dimensional world. That part of it, yeah, I'll agree with that.
Good. What I found interesting was how you sometimes focus on one aspect of the piece of art, and it seems to send you down a rabbit hole to a moment of personal reflection. Is that accurate? Or am I reading something that's not there?
No, I think that is absolutely there. I mean, I love rabbit holes. I think every poem I've ever written is invested in getting, at least to some extent, in the wandering of the rabbit hole. So, going in and being able to jump from one thing to another almost in non sequitur ways, these enormous tangential kind of discursive ruminations. Absolutely. And as one does that, yes, I begin to reflect. So you begin to reflect on all sorts of things, whether it's about pleasure and trying to figure out, the great Epicurean kind of sense of what it means to pursue pleasure becomes a reflection in one of those Jonathan Wood poems. But it has to go through that rabbit hole, as you say, or a wormhole of thinking through, that it takes place, at a baseball park in America. And it has to start there in order to get to this other place, which becomes this otherworldly Arctic-like zone.
Okay, so for someone reading Xenia, etc., would you recommend they read your words and then seek out the picture, or maybe just kind of have a quick look at the picture first before they read it? And it comes back to this really massive poetic question: does a poem need an explanation, or should it stand alone?
No, I never thought anybody would need to look at the paintings. And in fact, I toyed at one point with basically, because the poems are so loosely dealing with the art, I at one point thought, do I need to reference the art even? But I wanted to, because I wanted to let the reader in on my process, which was springboarding from these great works of visual art. I mean, ideally, I would think that the reader might, take a look at the poems and then become interested enough to pursue the art, because the visual art is so wonderful that, part of the job of the book, I suppose, might be to, introduce the readers to some of these visual artists that they may or may not know, even though they are quite well known in certain circles. As you say, not everybody will know who they are.
I mean, I had to look. I felt I had to look as part of my research. Yeah. And I was mesmerised by some of Kusaka's work. Those pots, there is such a fine delicacy in what she's doing that almost only a Japanese potter could do. I mean, it's so precise, isn't it?
Oh, it's gorgeous. And yet she'll talk about it. And one of my favorite things about the Kusaka pots is they never achieve, nor do they seek that absolute perfection. There's like asymmetries built into her work. It's almost this like practiced. She could clearly make for a perfect pot in terms of its its form and its structure and its decoration, but she chooses to allow for the human quality of error or asymmetry, and that for me is where they're just absolutely pristine. It's like the studied sense of imperfection at times.
Can we talk a bit more about Henry Taylor?
Yeah.
And I've looked at some of his work as well, and it's very clear that, as a black man painting in the white world today, that it cannot be possible to divorce yourself from Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And it's something that is very, very evident in the poetry that you've brought out. And I'd like to ask you, would you mind reading us a section from, and you please choose, of any one of the pieces you've written in relation to Henry Taylor?
Yeah, sure thing. I'll probably read the first one, but I'll say this first. And I think you're 100% right about, Taylor's work and the importance of it. I actually wrote this poem in the middle of the most recent Black Lives Matter movement during the COVID pandemic. And I was really, really trying to figure out, how does one contribute to this conversation? How does one, recognize the incredible strain and work that's being kind of put to us today by people like Taylor. And what Taylor did, Taylor painted Philandro Castile, who was shot dead by a policeman, and that work for me is just one of the most visceral and heartbreaking works. And I saw that work in the Whitney Museum in 2017. So while the most recent Black Lives Matter movement was, kind of spurred on and around George Floyd, I wanted to go back to that 2017, that moment when Henry Taylor, saw that video that we all saw about Philandro Castile being shot, and I wanted to somehow write about it. And so, I'm happy to read the first section.
So we're going to hear the section now this is from The Floaters?
No, it's called Woe.
Oh, from Woe, okay.
It's actually the first section.
Yeah, first section.
So the poem is called, Upon Seeing Henry Taylor's The Times, They Ain't A-Changing Fast Enough, with the subtitle Whitney Biennial Exhibition, New York 2017, which is where Taylor was being exhibited with his work at that time, this major biennial in America. So the first section is called Woe. We were at a bar not far from the Whitney. You guys aren't going to the Whitney, another friend said when we mentioned going to the Whitney. We were talking all sorts of shit because shit was fun to talk when drinking in the city. I was rarely in the city, and to be in the city and to not see Henry Taylor, I'd rather not see you, I said to my friend with a smile on my face. If you are listening, you can't be talking, my kindergarten teacher used to say, and which I have repeated to my own children enough times. Henry Taylor's The Times They Ain't A-Changing Fast Enough was one of the paintings at the Whitney that people were talking about, but we hadn't yet heard the talking. Zadie Smith would later write, she thought for a moment that it was a presentation of a single eyeball. We didn't see the eyeball, but it's true the painting seemed to be seeing us. In most Henry Taylor paintings, the colors make me want to hang out with old friends, like the one who come with me to the Whitney. I like making people feel good, says Henry Taylor. And then we saw, lying back in his car, Philandro Castile was dead, shot by a policeman, the short-sleeved arm cropped at the left edge of the painting, gun in hand. Henry Taylor didn't want to show this painting. And standing here before you now, I can tell you I didn't plan to begin this poem with this painting of a man who was shot and killed in his car, forest green interior, wearing a white T-shirt, staring up into the midnight blue, like a tomb, wrote Tadayama Isolina. Sunlight of mustard, filling the space of the windows. Wow, 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 said Henry Taylor, when asked what was going through your mind when you painted Castile. In so many Henry Taylor paintings, the sun is shining, on people barbecuing, running, posing for a portrait, sitting on a beach chair, on a couch, standing in front of the White House, in a field, in the front yard, on the front porch, lying in a bathtub, riding horseback. Woe, I say, woe, invoking the command to a horse to make it stop or slow down, or to urge a person, myself, to stop and wait.
Thank you. Now, as Anthony knows, because I've had these conversations with him before, I'm a massive fan of Spain, and in particular Andalusia, where it is my intention to relocate at some point. And I read an Andalusian town, and it led me to watch the video on YouTube of Un Chien Andalusien.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come across that? Because that's pretty obscure.
Well, it isn't. It isn't. I mean, it's I think it's a famous enough short film. But how did I get to the film? Like, I mean, I got to the film, being a kid from the Boston area in the 1980s when the Pixies broke, and the Pixies sang a song about this, and so that's how it for me. The song is Debaser. It's a famous enough tune, and it's invested in looking at Dali and Buñuel's short film Un Chien Andalou, and I just loved that refrain. I am Un Chien Andalusia, and how they kept kind of playing with it. So that's how I came to the short film. Okay. It was through the Pixies.
Yeah, it was. For any of you who've not watched it, I suppose a trigger warning is when they cut an eye open with a cutthroat razor, and I've got a pretty strong stomach, but it made me kind of go gulp. So let's just talk briefly now about some of your previous work that's been published. I mean, I'm looking at a dynamic exchange between us and the Victor poems, both of which I have to freely confess I have skimmed through, not gone through in great detail, when I first came to this university, and I think it was pure accident. I was looking for something in the library, and I come across a book. Hang on, this guy's one of our lecturers. So that was the Victor poems. Does Victor exist? Is he real?
No, I mean Victor's a cipher as much as anything. But for me, Victor was, he was a godlike figure. He was that friend that we've all kind of wanted or had at one point in our lives, that kind of evaded us and that disappeared. And I think that book was very much about friendship and the pursuit of it. And I was at a particular point when I was thinking about my life and living in various places over the past 30 years. And you pick friendships up and you manage them, and then you move, and how do you keep those friendships active? Well, the Victor poems became a pursuit of that kind of mode of philosophical friendship. So I was reading a lot of the philosophical the philosophers about friendship as well. And so Victor's not real, but certainly he's a cipher for just about a lot of the friends that I've had in my life.
Okay, and the dynamic exchange between us. What's the ethos of that, or the philosophy of that?
That book is utterly, for me, concerned with looking at language as a dynamic exchange between people, and language as a way to find a higher ground, to transcend into almost a spiritual space. And I think, language is a fascinating way, when we read spiritual texts, to connect to that kind of space. So that book was very much about that. It was about looking at and, metaphysically looking at language as a way to perform that dynamic exchange, so that connection between people, that linguistic connection, that language, those words that come between people, was actually something kind of higher. It transcended them, it transcended the moment, and it pushed them into this other space, this space concerned with not just this world, but the after.
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to connections, if there are things that connect us, there's something massively that's connected the world recently, i.e. the pandemic. Can you say a little bit about the project you've been involved in relation to that?
Yeah, again, so that project was Poetry in COVID. We had a website called poetryincovid.com.
Indeed, and I do believe I'm published on it.
You are published.
I'm on it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as well as another almost 1,000 poets around the world were published on that site during the pandemic. And what we've been talking about is the idea that language is a way to care for each other, to care for oneself, to care for the world, to think through your life. And that project was very much about giving people the platform to put, their care for language, their care for poetry into that space, into that virtual space, and to connect us during a period of lockdowns when we were unconnected.
Yeah.
So that website, I think, performed that really valuable task.
Well, there were some things that kind of connected with that. I vividly recall a Zoom presentation. It was kind of you had poets from all over the world who were collaborating and responding to each other's words.
Yes,
and that actually was a bit of a trigger for me to listen to poetry rather than reading poetry.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the thing that we've almost lost in our modern world is people don't listen to poems half as much as they did probably 100 years ago. Poems have become very much page bound, and that was an opportunity to get those poets from around the world to kind of read their poems into that virtual space and to allow people to hear them, because it's a tangible kind of connection. We feel when we hear something, I think. So we feel that tangible connection to the scene that's being detailed or documented. And it's also, we feel connected to the poet that's reading those poems.
Yeah, I mean, actually, last night, it has led to me seeking out more spoken word poetry. And I was surprised that you have to look to find it. And in fact, in an upcoming podcast, we will be discussing spoken word in more detail with hopefully Nick Ingram from Gin City Publications and Leadworks. And I was at an open mic evening last night where somebody read a piece of work, and their persona as they read their words changed from the one that you speak to beforehand. You know, they are living in that poetic moment as they speak. And I think actually it kind of it strengthens poetry for me to hear it rather than to read it. Would you agree with that, or does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a wonderful way to experience poetry. So, you know, even if one reads the poem aloud to themselves, I think it's something that's important. You know, whether it's a poem you've written or a poem you've read, to read it aloud to yourself is just such a treat. And it's just because of the way those words kind of rumble in the mouth, whether they're like marbles or.
I did actually rather cheekily on one of my submissions put in the critical aspect of it, saying, I would hope that the marker would read this aloud to get some impact of where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Did I do well on that? Yeah, I didn't do too bad on that. But anyway, so it's been a very interesting conversation, Anthony. And when can we hope to hear you speaking in public next?
Oh, I'm giving a reading at the university in November with a wonderful poet who also did the MA in creative writing with us, Rachel Trippetti, who's also from the Boston area. And Rachel has a new book out, pamphlet out with a Plymouth publisher called Shoals of Starlings is the name of the publisher. And I don't know the name of her book because it's not just out yet, but it's going to be out by November. We thought we would have a kind of a dual book launch. I'll read from Xenia, etc., and she'll read from her book with Shoals of Starlings.
Fantastic. Anthony, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Richard.